Hi, everyone,
Wait.
and welcome
All right.
to this. Are we live?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the second episode of the series, The Selfish Lovers. So Gloria is not with me today. She had to take the week off, but what a treat we have for you. We have Lisa VanDamme. So Lisa is the director and literature teacher in the VanDamme Academy. And also, she is the founder of the app Read With Me, through which you can go through some of the best works of literature with the guidance of Lisa. So if you know anything about Lisa, she's one of the best advocates, so to speak, for the power of literature. And I would say of art in general. So I would encourage people, for example, to check her Ocon speech, The Power of Poetry. And it's something that is definitely going to inspire you. So where does romance come in all this? So we're going to discuss today, what is the role of romance in one's love life, in one's romantic life? So can it play a role, for example, to inspire us or to tell us what is possible? Or maybe it is even misleading, and it can make us have all these hopes that life is going to be like the books, and then life is not like that, and we get disappointed. So, Lisa, first of all, tell us a bit about how you got interested in literature and where does this passion for literature comes from?
Sure. I just want to clarify. I think you said we're going to talk about the role of romance in your love life, but I think you meant to say we're going to talk about the role of literature. And
of course, and from all the stuff that's been happening in the last 3 minutes, that's the worst. That's the least of the things that could have gone bad.
Okay, we're ready to start here.
Yeah.
How did I get interested in literature? I got interested in literature really when I attended my first objectivist conference, and it featured Leonard Peikoff teaching a course called 8 Great Plays. It was actually called 7 Great Plays at the time, but he added one in later. And prior to that, I had no real personal interest in literature. I was not an avid reader as a child. I had never felt moved or emotionally connected to any great works of literature, but having Dr. Peikoff as my guide, teaching me not just exposing me to some of the greatest plays ever written, but teaching me a process for integrating, understanding, thinking deeply about those works of literature, and then thinking about how they connect to my life and what personal values I can draw out of them. It was a completely life-changing experience and changed my approach to reading literature after that. And then really it was by teaching that I developed a more intense passion for it, because once I was put in the position of having to guide others through that process, it made my own love of it greater and greater.
Right. And this is the 2 ways through which we're going to draw from your experience today, both as someone who understands literature, but also as someone who has taught it, and what you have seen the effects of literature being on young people and how they understand romance and how understand their life and this aspect of their life. So also just to say to our audience, you can ask questions in the chat. Razi behind the scenes is responsible for the chat. So if there's a super chat question, he will let us know and we will answer it. So Lisa, I'm going to start by saying something about how I view the role of literature in romance, and you can tell us what you think about it. So when I was thinking about it, it's a bit like a barometer. It tells you in a way where you are. So I was trying to think, well, okay, the big, let's say, moments in your romantic life. And I realized, for example, that you can even realize that you're in love when you listen to a song, for example. Not because of the song, but the song, you listen to it and you remember one person and you say, oh, does this mean that I didn't realize that there was this feeling inside? But also it can, for example, when things are going well, you can read a very life-affirming, positive love story, for example, and this can accelerate what you are feeling. So, and then we're also going to get to the more negative parts, or the parts where art is giving you the sign that something is not going well. But let's start on a positive note. So how about this? How about literature as giving, let's say, words to what you're feeling and making it even better?
There's a writer named Elizabeth Drew who wrote a book called Poetry, a guide to its, a guide, okay, I'll have to look up the title for it, but as a guide to understanding and appreciating poetry. Elizabeth Drew is the author. And she says at one point that poetry helps give words, you're saying, to your feelings. The phrase she uses for it is, it gives words for things you dimly and dumbly feel. And that phrase really stuck in my mind, because there are lots of feelings, transitory, not focused on, not clearly grasped, not conceptualized, not even really carefully noticed or identified feelings that we might experience on a moment-to-moment, day-to-day basis, some of them more profound than others. But even those that we feel very strongly, we won't necessarily know what they are or how to identify them or what they really mean to us. And great artists are people, first of all, I think, who are capable of experiencing those feelings on a very profound level, but then who also had the facility and the brilliance to conceptualize, identify, and put to memorable, dramatic, clear words what exactly that feeling is. So I imagine that's the experience you're describing, that you felt something, but then you heard the music, or you read the scene in a novel, or you heard the line of poetry, and you thought, oh, that's what I felt, and I didn't even realize it before.
Yeah, and not only, so that's the one thing, but also the other thing, mostly our most beautiful moments, we relate them in a way to art. Like it would be a very weird thought experiment, for example, to try to think how would be the days when I was mostly in love if it weren't for that music that I was listening, or I could remember what song was in fashion that summer, for example. Or most people have this film that they've seen with someone, I don't know, Casablanca or whatever, or and then it relates to that moment. So a second possible barometer, though, is one that is telling you that, you know what, you're not following the right path in life. And here's an example. So I'll give a personal example here. So there was a period, let's say, where in my romantic life, it was quantity over quality. Let's put it this way, and not super fulfilling. But the moment I realized it wasn't super fulfilling was I had discovered Audible. I had just discovered Audible, and I was listening to Atlas Shrugged. And it was this scene where Francisco gives his speech on love and romance to Hank. And in a way, in retrospect, and the thing is, it was not the first time that I would read or listen to that scene. It was probably the 5th time I would read the book. But only then, so I read it 4 times, I understood the scene. So if you told me, go to a class, let's say, of people who haven't understood, who don't know who Ayn Rand is, and tell them her theory on sex, I could very easily do it. But it was only in listening to that scene within that frame of mind that, oh, now that's how my romantic life is, that it kind of struck me and says, no, that's not cool. And in a retrospect, I reappreciated some experiences that on a superficial level, let's say, were cool experiences, as suddenly something that was very unfulfilling, and even something that maybe should be, okay, you can't erase, but something that you're not proud of. So the question is, was this healthy? Or is this in a way a rationalization that, oh, now this book has this status of, let's say, this dogma that it says, thou shalt not have random sex or whatever. And then suddenly it's like, oh my God, I have sinned.
There's a lot in what you just mentioned. So the first thing that occurs to me is that great authors are extremely talented psychologists. They have to bring their characters to life in a way that really conveys their motivations and why they're doing what they're doing, what they're thinking. And so they have to be very astute psychological observers and then very talented communicators of the nature of that psychology. And so I think that's why something that you might be able to philosophically, a philosophy you might be able to recite, but then seeing this played out in the form of a character in this very psychologically astute manner might have a more powerful impact on you, certainly in that moment. And the other thing is that reading a work of literature, I've heard there's an English professor named Mark Edmondson who writes a lot about the power of literature in a person's life. And one of the things he says is that reading is like reincarnation, because you get to, or it's like living lives over and over again in all these different settings, in these different forms, as different people. And so when you read that scene, you're sort of living that character's life in that moment. And that's going to have a more direct emotional impact on you than reading just the abstract description of a certain idea. So that's I can imagine that being the reason that scene felt so powerful and kind of grabbed you in that moment.
Yeah, which again, it verifies this idea that it's a barometer, like it's or it's one of these instruments that tell you how you're doing. So in a way, how you react to something in art, and specifically in literature, it's telling you, yeah, thumbs up or thumbs down. And it's interesting how it can be both. So I have more cases, let's say, to ask about, but I want also to give you a chance to talk a bit about what is your experience with literature and romantic life, either yourselves or maybe from your experience as an educator.
Well, one thing that occurs to me is that the examples that you are focusing on have mostly to do with the content of what you're reading in great literature. So the ideas or the situations that are presented. And I think of the impact as having more to do with the form of literature and not the specific content. If that weren't true, then we would only get good, valuable direction from things that had good, healthy, positive, rational, philosophic content. And I think there's lots of works of literature that are philosophically problematic that would still have a very positive impact on a person's development in, spiritually and romantically. And I think that has to do with just the form of literature, what literature is per se, at least a great work of literature. So if you read any pop psychology book on romance, one of the things it's going to say is that a person in the context of a romantic relationship really values feeling seen, right? It's kind of a common description of something we all seek in romance. We really want to feel seen by another person. Well, what does it mean to feel seen? It means that somebody is able to look at you, to strip away the inessentials, to see what really matters to you, what really moves you, what your fundamental values are, what defines you or makes you who you are. And that's a feat of observation and abstraction and careful attention. And it's one that I think is really well encouraged and taught and exemplified in a great work of literature, because in a great work of literature, it's a stylized universe where everything inessential is pushed to the side, and you're seeing straight into a character's soul, and everything they say integrates around their fundamental identity and everything they do. And so the author's doing that for the purpose of conveying a particular theme, a particular characterization, a particular theme. But the experience for the reader is that you both come to an understanding of that character and that theme, but also develop that habit and that capacity when you step away from the book and look at the real world, to also have that ability to see what really matters and what are the real values at stake in a person or a situation. So I feel like that desire to feel seen is something that can be developed by being a reader, by developing that capacity from reading great literature.
I wonder if you have a specific, that's very interesting. So I wonder if you have a specific example on how this concretizes. And something came just to my mind. So some weeks ago, we had Ellen Kenner to talk about her book, The Selfish Path to Romance, on the meetup. By the way, Ellen Kenner is our guest next week. So I encourage people to also show up next week. So anyway, she has this notion of visibility, which is it means to be seen. So when I read it on the book, I didn't really get it. So I asked her in the meetup, I still didn't really get it. But then we had next week, we had the reading group on for Ayn Rand Center UK members on With a Living. And there is this first scene between Leo and Kira. And what becomes so apparent is that although everything around them is very alienating, the moment they meet each other, it's like they see completely through each other. So, and I was like, yes, that's what visibility means. That's what it means to be seen. And that's why when he's about to leave, he says, I'll be back if I don't forget. And he means if I don't forget how it felt and how for 10 minutes I was myself and not someone who hasn't completely given up in life. Is this what you mean, that you see in literature what it means to be seen? Or do you mean that also through literature you can build a character, let's say, which is worthy of being seen, and you can see things in other people?
Yeah. Okay, so three things. It's funny because the first scene that comes to mind for me is the scene between Rourke and Stephen Mallory. So it's not exactly a scene of romance, but I still think of it as a very romantic scene in a sense. But it's when Rourke hires Mallory for the Stoddard Temple, and then he goes to his apartment after he doesn't show up for the meeting, and Mallory is absolutely disbelieving that Rourke could possibly sincerely value his work. He thinks that he must have come to him because of connections or because he pities him or, and then Rourke says, no, I came to you because your work is good. And so once he gets to the point of actually believing that Rourke is there because he sees with his own judgment and his own mind that his work is excellent and judges it that way for himself, and he actually feels appreciated, I think, for the first time in a long time. Then it progresses to Rourke seeing how lonely he's felt and how invisible he's felt, and he just invites him to talk about himself. And Mallory's so taken aback by that, saying, wait, you want to know what I think, and you want to know what I feel, and you want to, so that is a moment of profound visibility. I think that Mallory's felt totally invisible up to that moment, and now he feels seen by someone capable of seeing.
Is this why he burst also into tears? Is this kind of letting out that I'm in a quote safe space now? This guy understands me, so I can let off my guard and let it out.
Yeah, and I think it even says he was a man who you would think seemed to have never cried before.
Yeah.
Up to the moment. Yeah. So one thing you just mentioned is, okay, so literature gives you moments like that. It has these multiple benefits. So it gives you moments like that where you see a moment of visibility between two characters. So that's the content issue. But in terms of a method issue, you and I, in discussing that scene, just saw Rourke and saw Mallory because Rand laid out so clearly who each of these characters is and what they are bringing to each other in that moment, and just what that moment means in general. So the process of that experience of reading a scene like that and understanding what's happening and understanding its significance and understanding what that means, that both, yes, it does develop you as a person. There's a new and important aspect of life that we've come to understand by reading that scene. And so if you take that and extrapolate thousands or hundreds of thousands of those experiences over the course of reading work upon work of great literature, think of the enrichment and depth of soul that you develop from doing that. So part of it is that you become a person worthy of being seen, but also you become a person capable of seeing that in somebody else. That was the part that I was focusing on, is in being guided through that process, or having it kind of stripped down and made easy for you by a great artist, you develop a capacity to do that in your personal relationships, which are much more complex, much less transparent, much less essentialized, much less stylized. They're more complicated, but you can kind of get rid of the noise and see someone's essence in real life through the training that you develop of seeing it through the eyes of an artist.
So in a way, does this mean that, to put it in terms, so does this mean that it becomes easier for you to recognize values in someone else?
Absolutely. That's what I think so.
Right. So we have also the first super chat question. So the question is, do you think, and many thanks to Ella for the question, do you think literature can help prepare oneself to be ready to love and to be loved, which is related to what we were just saying? If yes, how do you think literature can do that?
So, I mean, that does seem like what we were just talking about. So how else can it do it?
So how about this? How about showing you what it's actually about? So let me bring one example. Let's say you have one of these relationships that you love the person, it's a good person, but there's not this spark, there's not this, command to rise, to use Ayn Rand's words, okay? And then, for example, you read either, I don't know, one of the great romance novels of all times, and you realize, oh my God, that's not me. But at the same time, this is possible. Or it could be someone who says, well, I'm gonna be, I don't buy into that stuff. And then, so they don't even try the moderate, not super exciting relationship. And then again, they read a book with a great story. It's like, oh my God, there's this whole thing in life that I'm missing. Could this be something that it, in a way, it shows you there is this thing which is possible and you're not having it, but you should try at least to have it.
Well, one thing I think is interesting about even trying to think about this is that we take for granted how much art we're exposed to on a regular basis. Certainly TV and movies, everybody consumes regularly, but even literature and poetry, most people have at least some amount of that in their lives. And so it's easy to sort of take for granted the effect it has on us in developing our capacity to value, or capacity to enjoy and appreciate and understand life. So it's easy to take it for granted, but the things that are the classics of literature, those are the things that are consumed less. I think the classics are consumed less and less as time goes on. And those I see as providing all of that value on a much richer, much deeper, much more substantive scale. So I think if let me give you a silly connection, but it just happened to come up in class today. We're reading To Kill a Mockingbird. And in To Kill a Mockingbird, there's a new teacher who comes to this backwoods town, Macomb, in Macomb County, and reads these farm kids a story about cats. And they're kind of anthropomorphized cats. And the kids just look at her blankly like, what on earth is that? They're used to living off the land and, in a very reality-oriented, very simplistic sort of way. The idea of a story about cats is just unfathomable to them. Well, that's the sense in which we take it for granted, because this kind of weaving of fantasy stories or things that stray very far from our everyday existence is something we take for granted. So we can forget how much that's necessary for readying us for love or any other value. And what I like people to experience or see once in a while is that the values that we're exposed to every day in television and movies and can be can be deep. That experience can be deepened so much when you read the classics, because those are the ones written by the great geniuses, the most observant, most deep thinking, most intensely value-oriented writers throughout the course of history. So whatever watching a TV show and, forming a crush on the character and being excited about a romantic plot, whatever that does to make you more enthusiastic about or ready you for love, the great works of literature can do that on an even more fundamental scale.
Right. Okay. So I'll play half devil's advocate here, half it's a genuine question. So the question from Ella is literature preparing you to be ready to love? My worry is, what if it is preparing you to be destroyed in love? Let me give you an example. So I remember I was, very, very, very young, and I had this crush to this girl. And I remember I was reading, it was probably Romeo and Juliet. I was like, okay, I'm in love. Therefore, I need to be guided by reading the love story, and it's going to tell me exactly what I'm going to do. Anyway, in my head, it made the situation even bigger. So in retrospect, it was a pleasant experience. But anyway, another example, a bit more realistic. So I remember some years ago, I was reading this book, The Lady of the Camellias by Alexander Dumas the Son. So I've never read a book with so many good lines on love. But here's the problem. It's one of these things that I say, don't try this at home. So this guy falls completely for that girl. He puts her on the biggest pedestal that you can imagine. So although this book is indeed, in a way, food for the soul when it comes to it's a romance larger than life, at the same time, the message that this guy is telling you on how to pursue love, in my opinion, is going to be destructive. Is going to sabotage your love life, because I don't want to enter in discussing, what people like, what women want in romance, but personally, as Nikos, I don't think it would work. But at the same time, it's so inspiring. So what happens there? Can actually this inspiration by art sabotage your love life?
That's an interesting question. Well, I certainly don't think it would be wise for anybody to take any particular work of literature as a roadmap for their own love life. That would probably be insane. And there's always, it's a dramatized and stylized and very exaggerated situation, usually, to convey a theme with a lot of intensity. So I don't think the authors themselves would intend for you to follow it as a guide, as opposed to some sort of inspiration. So one thing you could say to that is just be very widely well-read. Read lots of different authors with lots of different perspectives, showing lots of different scenarios from which you can draw inspiration that comes together by your own judgment into a sensible way to conduct your own life. But I think that's where, too, I go back to feeling like it's not so much about the content, the specific content. There are always specific content things you're going to learn, but can't you just take away from Romeo and Juliet the capacity, learn something about the capacity to love with that intensity, if not in that form. And
even the independent thinking that they dare to go against the tribal conflict going on, and it's like, no, you're the one I want, so who cares about, let the world burn in a way.
Yeah, and you always, obviously, literature's, you're going to be having life experience reading nonfiction. There's all sorts of inputs that go into the formation of your soul and your decisions as how you want to conduct your romantic life. So I like the idea of sort of immersing yourself and giving yourself over to the author while you're in the work. And even I call it suspension of philosophic disbelief. Put aside your own philosophy for the moment and just give yourself over to that author if they're a great author. Experience their world, take in their views, And then afterwards, when you close the book, step away and process that and think about it and integrate it with the rest of your knowledge and understanding. I actually had a great example of this in class the other day, because I'm always in class making a very strong point of confining our discussion to coming to an understanding of what the author's view is and not imposing our own views onto the author, and especially not imposing my view onto the author. I never go into class and say, here's what I think about this author's idea. It's always an effort to guide them to understand what this author is saying. So we recently read a play called The Browning Version. Are you familiar with that? Okay, The Browning Version is a play by Terence Rattigan. And it's about this old classics teacher at a private boarding school who's misunderstood and unappreciated. The kids don't care about the classics. They want to go into science class and blow things up. And they like the teachers who are cool and relatable and have a lot of humor. And this guy is kind of remote and stuffy and, you know, cares about these abstract things that they don't care about. And over time, he becomes kind of withered and withdrawn and gives up on the world. And then meanwhile, his bitter shrew of a wife totally comes to despise him and turns against him and tears him apart. And you end up feeling this profound pity for this man who does have these real substantial values to offer people, but he's offering them to a world that's more on the premise of the physical material rather than the spiritual.
What's in it for me? Yeah.
What's in it for me? So anyway, the point of this is, at one point I was helping the kids to understand this character versus the world he was in. And at one point, this character apologizes for having his wife is having an affair behind his back. She complains about him being ignorant to the facts of life because he's all, you know, he's got his head in the clouds. And she is one of the nastiest, most passive aggressive characters in all literature, and they despise her. But at one point, the character, the professor character, apologizes to her for having married her and says, I thought my version of love was the right one, but your version of love, which for her is more physical, and your version of love is equally valid, and I should have taken that seriously. And I asked the kids, does the author believe that? Does the author believe that this nasty shrew who's two-timing her husband, her version of love is as valuable as his? And they said, no, clearly not. His is superior, his spiritual approach to love. And so that's where we came down. And then one of the students at the end said, well, why doesn't physical love matter? I think that sounds like it's just as important as spiritual love. And it was this amazing moment of everything in this book, of this play, integrated around the idea that his version of love was superior and that spiritual love is what matters more than physical. But she, maybe prior to closing the book, just kind of pushed that aside and said, I don't know what I think about that. So that seems like the healthy way to approach a work of literature is, yes, try to deeply understand the author's perspective, but then step away and
yeah, and actually that's what I had in mind with saying that it can sabotage, because maybe this character that you mentioned, because he's immersed, let's say, in these books and literature, he expects this huge love. And this brings me to my next question, which is literature and art being a mirror that distorts reality. And this could be in two. You could see it as a positive and as a negative. The positive is, again, let's say you're in a relationship that is not super inspiring. In a way, you are a Hank Rearden with a Lillian, but you haven't realized it. And you read Hank's journey, and you realize that, yeah, I shouldn't be with Lillian. I should be looking for the Dagny. That's the one thing. The other thing, though, where it could go really wrong, or you can tell me if that's wrong, is that you're going to say, you know what? Unless I find this, or unless I find this, sorry, but either the world is not good enough for me or I'm not good enough in the world. I don't know. But unless I find this thing, unless I see someone, for example, and like Kira says, and because and as he believes in miracles, he said good evening or something like that, something like you see in your head that this is a moment that could be literature. You don't do anything, or you retreat to yourself. So we already have many movements out there who are telling people retreat to yourself, like male tribalism, MGTOWs, whatever. Now, how about we add one more, which is the very romantic ones, influenced by literature. And because of the influence of literature, they say, oh, you know what? There's not, if it's not that thing, I don't want anything. By the way, I'm not saying that, I'm not convinced that this is necessarily bad. I'm just asking your view on it.
Well, one thing I would ask is, so I know that danger so well. You watch a movie, you fall in love with the hero or the heroine, and you think that's what I want from love, and I won't be satisfied with anything else. And if that's true, literally, then you won't be satisfied. And one question you can ask yourself, well, is you fall in love with the hero or heroine, well, are you yourself the one on the other? So if you're reading the Hank Rearden and Lillian versus Dagny, do you really view yourself as Hank Rearden? I mean, maybe in abstract essence, you think you have something in common with him, but are you the perfectly stylized, absolutely flawless vision of the hero that's portrayed that way? So if you wouldn't think that about yourself, it's not what you should be seeking in love. So I see the danger of becoming maybe the romantic rationalist or something, where you're kind of abstracting it away from everyday reality and thinking you'll only be satisfied with a pure idealized vision that can't exist in reality. But instead, I think it's best to just think of it as, first of all, think of it as aspirational, as literature as exemplifying the essence of the traits of character you want from yourself or from another person. And then again, going back to the visibility thing, someone who too literally just wants a character straight out of a novel, I think maybe hasn't developed the capacity to see those traits as they exist in a real life person. And maybe those people are hard to find who possess those traits, but they're not non-existent. And you have to be able to look through the noise and find the essence that is the possession of those character traits.
Right. I'm going to push back a bit on that, because I have a slight objection. By the way, just to say, people, again, thank you for the super chats, and we still have something like 15, 20 minutes, so you still have time to ask questions if you want. So I understand that if you see yourself as Hank, whereas you're clearly not Hank, or if you see yourself as Dominique and you're not Dominique, yeah, that's a problem. You need to do some talking with yourself or some self-development, whatever. But this does not take away the reality that, again, if you know that this kind of romantic love is possible, even if you're not Hank, you do want something that powerful. Maybe it's not Hank and Dagny, maybe it is something else. Maybe it's the two kids from the village that, or that, what's the name of that Murakami story? These young kids who meet in a village and then they meet again after some years, and it's this huge love story. But in any way, it's something big. So even if you are not an Atlas Shrugged level of character, how can you compromise to a relationship which is good but not explosions good, when you know that this is possible? So you could say, am I actually missing in life? And the next step would be, it's better to be alone so that when these things come, I'm ready, rather than to be with my partner who I love, she loves me, but he doesn't wake up this heroic thing or that, as they say in the book, after the first night, I thought I would never ever sleep again, and I wouldn't ever need to sleep again because that's the level of energy I'm running off. I'm so excited.
So what's the problem, though? Is it that literature creates a false expectation in you, or is it that literature gives you high standards that you...
Is it a false expectation? No, because even if you've lived it once, even if there was one night that you said yes, then the rest of your life suddenly is very weird, literature or no literature. So literature can show it to you how that feels. Even worse, you felt it in the past, you relive it through literature, and then you're like, okay, so what's next? Either it's going to be something that's going to top it, or it's not good enough.
So so what's the problem then?
The problem is that you're going to probably end up forever alone unless you manage to top this big moment, this huge love that you once had or that you saw in the literature. So you have this idealistic view of life that I want to suck life, to drink life, as Andy Bernstein said in one thing. I don't want to sip a thing. I want the whole ocean of life.
I still don't hear a problem because I think that the higher your ideals and the greater your ambitions, the better. And if it's real and it's out there, then yeah, maybe the choice to be alone until you find it is the right one. And it just seems like if you actually believe that one moment of great romance is worth waiting for, there's no way of talking yourself out of that into complacency with something more ordinary. But I do think there's a danger in misinterpreting what those moments mean or how they're achieved or how they're found. And maybe they can be found more readily than people would believe, because they've got too exaggerated an idealized vision of what those moments look like.
And that's definitely the case also with romantic literature. So I think Ayn Rand, at some point, someone asked her, what if God had like a cold sore when he first went to, he said, that's not the point. Yeah, that's, but I mean, in real life, so to speak, there would be days where Dagny would wake up in the morning with a bad breath and Hank would be like, let me sleep. But anyway, let's not, but that's definitely, something that you wouldn't see in literature. Yeah. Okay, since we're reaching towards the end, how about you telling us a bit about how do you teach this love for literature? So how do you wake up this into someone? So you mentioned the kids in that novel you're teaching. They sound a lot like most of the students in an average university today, which is like, okay, you're gonna tell us some things, but I'm not even sure if I want to be here. Entertain me, basically. Quite often, this is the attitude. So how can you, in this environment, wake up this vision that, look, I'm gonna introduce you to a world which you have so much to gain because it's gonna blow your mind the way it happened with me, for example?
I've always found it remarkably easy, actually. And part of that is just the general environment of the school that we've created. So there is no resentment for bitterness toward, resistance toward education at all in the environment of the school. I have a staff of incredibly passionate, intelligent, driven teachers who really care about the things they're teaching, and the kids feel that from the first day of school in kindergarten. And by the time I get them in 7th and 8th grade, they've just drunk it in, and they come to school eager and excited for whatever I have to teach them. So I feel like the ground has been readied for me, and they've been reading great literature from the time they can read fluently in 1st grade, great children's literature, and I just get to introduce them to the adult literature when they get to me. But so the key for me, once they're in 7th and 8th grade and they have this generalized positive attitude toward literature, is to choose really, really great literature that is very accessible and I hate the term relatable because it's abused, but that contains themes with which they can really relate, and those can be it can be unobvious why they would relate to them, but I've learned over time what the list of literature is that for 7th and 8th graders is very motivating and very stimulating to them. So for example, we started the year in 8th grade with Ibsen's A Doll's House. Well, this is a Norwegian, 19th century Norwegian play about a woman in a constrained by feminine female roles at the time in this, which seemingly happy, and then she discovers very unhappy marriage. Seems like 8th graders wouldn't really be able to relate to that, but it just contains these themes of personal identity and discovering what really matters to you as a person, learning what you actually understand for yourself and what you don't understand for yourself. And they get very moved by and very excited about it. So if I choose the right works of literature, guide them through it step by step, have animated discussions with them about helping them to integrate the characters and understand the themes, it's easy to hook them.
So, and to give some context to people who, the thing with VanDamme Academy is that you create and you nurture this environment from very early. So yeah. You have created this school, you have built it based on your own principles and values, if you understand well. Therefore, the kids are in this process. So I'll use the co-host privilege and ask my own super chat, which is let's leave people with something positive in terms of what are 5 of your favorite love stories. So if someone is, you know what, I need inspiration in my life, holidays coming, this has been a tough year, a tough term, give me something that's gonna light my heart on fire for Christmas. So what would be your 5, let's say, top suggestions?
Okay, you've got to think of yours too. Because it's an interesting question. It's not going to be totally easy for me, I think. And there's 2 reasons for that. One is because I teach 7th and 8th grade and I want it to be themes with which they can relate, I don't do much romance at all. Because romance for them is, of course, they're having their little budding crushes and stuff, but the great romances of literature are very much lost on them. They can't quite, they haven't had the experiences that will allow them to relate to those values. But the first one I think of, I'm going to, of course, favor things that I covered in Read With Me, because then anyone who wants to download the app, I guide you step by step. I read the work aloud to you, and then I guide you through it step by step and help you to understand.
By the way, Razi, can you put the Read With Me link to the chat for people so that they can follow it?
Okay, so I have to say first and foremost is Cyrano de Bergerac by Edmond Rostand. Rostand is the ultimate idealist. Cyrano de Bergerac is one of the few characters with whom I very literally felt like I fell in love when I read the play. I felt a deep attachment to this person as if he were real. And it is, I wish I could read it in the original French, because Rostand's poetry and fluency with language is almost unmatched. And even the translation by Brian Hooker is quite good. So Cyrano is just a deep and poetic and passionate lover. And he suffers and sacrifices so much for his love. So Cyrano de Bergerac is one. Another, also in Read With Me, is called White Nights by Dostoevsky. Have you ever read that?
I've read The Eternal Husband, but I haven't read White Nights. So
you should definitely read White Nights, because White Nights actually contains a line with it that I almost felt like you were quoting. And it was like something about it's a guy who's a dreamer and lives in a fantasy world because the real world is too prosaic for him. And he's just so unsatisfied with life as it is. So he lives in this dream world, fantasy world, but then he falls in love in real life. And I don't want to give plot spoilers, but he says, for one moment, everything else is worth sacrificing for just one moment, even if it doesn't last. I'm also right now reading probably the most conventionally cited of all romance novels, Pride and Prejudice. That's what we're doing in Read With Me currently. And it's a great one. What else?
How about Love in the Times of Cholera? So
I
read it in my Marxist phase, and
okay.
I was then in a huge, like, unrequited love phase, and I completely, not sympathize. I felt completely for the guy. Now, in retrospect, I don't know how I would feel about it, but what about this idea that you're so in love with that one person, throughout the time you have all these meaningless affairs, but you can't overcome her basically for the rest of your life?
Sorry, I missed. What was the question?
No, if you like the book, and if you think that it's a good love story.
I have not read it.
Oh, right. It's probably Marquez is so big in Greece because of the dominance of left in the culture. So specifically for every leftist, it is definitely the first romantic book that you're supposed to read. Okay, how about then Dostoevsky's The Eternal Husband? Because he gives this. So this is the eternal lover versus the eternal husband. So it's one woman, two men, and it's this almost everlasting situation where you want the one because it's it's gonna be the good husband, but the other one is the adventurous personality. So I found it very interesting in terms of archetypes.
I haven't read that either, and that sounds fantastic. So that needs to go to the top of my list.
All right. And we're not allowed to use Ayn Rand because we're definitely gonna. Right. Okay. Last suggestion.
Let's see. One more suggestion.
I'll go first.
Okay, go.
Don't try this at home, people. But it's a good love story, The Lady of the Camellias. Don't try this at home.
Oh, yeah.
Don't be that guy. As Lisa said, absorb the beauty, absorb the feelings. When you finish the book, think and keep the beautiful lines and leave aside everything else.
Well, I'll throw two more in there of very different types. Another is also Rostand. It's called The Romantics. Not as well known, although there's a play, an American play called The Fantastics, which apparently was based on The Romantics. But The Romantics is just ingenious and fits very well with our theme for today. Because basically it starts as a cliche situation of two feuding families separated by a wall, and the son and daughter fall in love with each other and whisper sweet nothings across the wall, read Shakespeare to each other, and lament their thwarted love because of their father's feuds. So it starts out sort of almost as a cliche, and then you cut to the next scene and the fathers meet each other in the yard, embrace, pat each other on the back and said, weren't we brilliant for staging this feud so that our children would fall in love with each other and we could join our estates and live happily all as one. So that's just the setup for it. And the idea of it is that as soon as the kids find out that this was plotted by their parents, and that this fantasy, dramatic, kind of cliche literary fantasy life that they were leading was all false, then they fall out of love. Then they're not interested in each other anymore. They look at each other and see each other as sort of prosaic and ordinary, and they don't care about each other anymore. And so the whole theme of the play is coming to understand what is real romance, what really counts as romance. And do you need to be living a Shakespearean tragedy for the romance to be real? Or was there something else within their relationship that could make for a real romance between them? That one's fantastic.
Isn't it true, though, that when you create this atmosphere that it's me and you versus the world, there is something powerful to this kind of Bonnie and Clyde thing? Anyway, okay, so this was very fun. So I'm really tempted to ask you if maybe at some other point we can do the same about films. So your 10 favorite romantic films, my 10 films, and we see and we compare. So thanks so much, Lisa. So tell us a bit more how people can find more about your work. I already encourage people to go and check your 2 lectures, The Power of Poetry. So you mentioned poems that I hadn't read. Once you mentioned them, it was impossible not to go and, because I mean, I'm using it in the right, in the good way. You sold them so good. I felt like I have to read this immediately.
Good.
So that's where I would suggest people to maybe start when, if they like this episode, to see your approach to literature. But what would you suggest?
Okay, so by the way, the title for that one is Falling in Love with Poetry.
Sorry, Falling in Love with Poetry. Yeah.
Falling in Love with Poetry, because it is a 2-lecture series all on love poetry. So that one's perfect. I think the most important lecture I've given so far is one called Literature and the Quest for Meaning. And it's not specifically on romance, but it deals with a lot of the themes that we talked about here today, how reading great literature helps bring meaning to your life. And obviously that can be applied in romance. And then the Read With Me program, that's at readwithmesalon.com.
I'm not gonna repeat them because I'm notorious for making mistakes with names. The producer is texting me that instead of unrequited love, I'd said unretweeted love. Obviously, I meant unrequited love. So to our viewers, thank you very much. Make sure you like and subscribe to our YouTube page so that you get notifications for this type of events. Tomorrow, we have the psychology of Peter Keating in the series, The Psychology of Fountainhead, with Susanna, with Josh, with Andy Bernstein, with Gina Gorlin, and I'm not sure who I forget. So plenty of stuff happening. So feel free to like and subscribe. Lisa, thanks so much. I had a great time. I'm gonna definitely check Dostoevsky's White Nights from all the books you mentioned. That's the one that stuck with me. So thank you very much and all the best.
Thank you.